The people who I think had most to gain, as they saw it, were the military-industrial intelligence complex. It's a myth that the intelligence agents don't make policy. They make it all the time. They always say they're carrying out policy, and sometimes they are. The people who had most to gain were those who didn't want the peace in the world that John Kennedy had tried to turn the world toward when he and Khrushchev worked out the solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who didn't want John Kennedy to be president were those who were making incredible fortunes from war production.
Had Kennedy lived, I think we'd have had no Vietnam War, with all of its traumatic and divisive influences in America. I think we would have escaped that. I think the world would have escaped. The 50,000 odd Americans dead and 300,000 more wounded and over 500,000 more hooked on dangerous drugs and tropical diseases. The divisiveness of that war that so many of the people thought unjustified and unnecessary and it shouldn't have been there. It split this country widely, and many of those things have lingered on since.
Kennedy made a speech at American University in June of the year before he died, and he said, we live in one world, we got to breathe in the same air, and we got to live together, we're going to die together. He was very disturbed by our involvement in Vietnam, which he inherited. And there came a time when he called his generals in and spoke to them, and after he spoke to them, the Pentagon issued a small statement saying that we have re-evaluated our involvement in Vietnam and find that we can begin to withdraw our men. The plan was to begin by withdrawing 1,000 a month. 17,000 were to be withdrawn by the time of the election, which was a year later. One plane load reached the United States when John Kennedy was killed. 3 days after the assassination, the body wasn't yet in the ground. The Pentagon issued what it called a re-evaluation of its re-evaluation. And they said simply that we found that our re-evaluation was optimistic. And the rest is history. The whole world turned around on it. The world will not, within the lifetime of anybody living today, recover from just that.
Kennedy represented the voice of hope, a voice of opportunity, a voice for the future, uplift. People could hardly stand on their feet. They'd jump up and down when he came along the street. And this great voice of hope for the future, of a better America, was stilled by the assassin's bullets. And people were depressed and mourned over it and thought we have lost our brightest and best in the head.
The most important effect once the Warren Report came out was disenchantment and disillusionment, especially of that college generation. I can't tell you how many collegiate audiences reflected this. All people of all ages reflected it on the radio talk shows, which spent a lot of time on this. So people lost their faith in the government. And the government earned that loss of faith. And I think perhaps the second is more important, that when the government justifies a loss of faith, it really is a deep subversion.
The strongest ally the cover-up has had has been the American media, both because they are unable or unwilling to accept the conspiracy or the fact of the conspiracy, or because they know better and are serving their masters well. One of the two.
None of the things that the critics brought to light were treated responsibly by any responsible element of the press. If it hadn't been for the kookiest of all, the radio talk shows, we critics would not have been able to reach the people we did, and they were very important. The Washington Post resisted it, the New York Times resisted it, the major TV networks resisted it, unless you had something nutty, unless you had something dramatic, unless you had something they knew wasn't true. But substantial criticism never had a voice. And that's what the working of a democratic society requires. Most of all, when it's a crime of the magnitude of the subversiveness of this one, the assassination of a president.
If the press would just open their eyes, if the media would accept the fact of the conspiracy, instead of just arbitrarily disbelieving, we'd have some allies. A handful of critics and researchers in this case have gotten remarkably far on their own. But if the press would just be honest about it and question and do their job, we could learn a lot more. The fact of the assassination conspiracy is beyond doubt. Only the scope is in question.
I'm a first-generation American. I'm the first member of my family born at least since the time of Christ. I can't go back to Adam. In freedom. None of my predecessors ever had it. And I've been a writer, an investigative reporter, a Senate investigator, an intelligence analyst. And the older I get, the more convinced I become that despite all its failings, we have the best system of self-government man has yet perfected, and it's got so many failings. But for the system to work, those who are responsible for seeing to it that it works have to see to it that it works. In this case, didn't happen. They subverted it instead. The assassination nullified our system, and the investigation nullified our system. My investigation has been different than that of others who are known as critics, because mine is a study of how the institutions of our society worked at the time of Great Crisis and since then. And obviously, the conclusion's obvious. They all failed. All, on all levels.
It is important to all of us to find out what really happened to President Kennedy. Because what happened to him could happen to anybody else. If a conspiracy can kill the President of the United States, who among us is safe?
If they lied to us, how much are they lying to us in other areas? And if they're lying to us, can they do it again and again and again? And if so, this is not a democracy. This is a hierarchy, a government or a people ran by certain powerful individuals who have the ability to dispose of anyone who's not going along the party line, so to speak. Not a whole lot different from what I was taught occurred in the USSR all these many years. The truth is the most important thing.
I think it's extremely important for the American people to know that there can be the overthrow of a government, that there can be a coup d'etat in America, that in fact did happen through the assassination of President Kennedy. In order to prevent that kind of thing from happening again, in order to expose the forces that were responsible for that kind of murder and the kind of cover-up that has ensued in the following 25 years, it's necessary to expose it. Otherwise, we can have the same thing repeated again. Therefore, in the same fashion that we have exposed problems and scandals involved with Watergate, problems in Vietnam, problems in Central America, problems in the overthrow of governments elsewhere like Allende in Chile, and on and on and on, so must we expose that same kind of political assassination in our country. As painful as it may be, as disruptive as it might be in a transitory nature, as embarrassing as it might be to certain individuals and organizations in the United States government, that has to be uncovered. If they were able to do it to John F. Kennedy then, they could do it to some other president in the future.